You can tell what kind of trouble you're flying into by the thickness of the file in your lap. Drug labs come with binders. Insurgent camps come with maps and names and grudges. That night over the interior of Brazil, I had a single clipped sheaf with half the lines painted over and a title that read like a dare. Deep Well, Bilateral Gravity Test Range, Joint Facility, classified beyond top secret. I worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency out of Washington. Most days I stayed welded to desks. Some days I got loaned to Joint Special Operations Command when someone wanted a case officer close enough to point at the bad thing on the ground. I was in my middle 30s, my knees still mostly willing, my patience worn down. Procedures made sense to me. Stories didn't. The trouble in my lap was thin and full of stories. Project Deep Well had run near the end of the Cold War, a joint experiment with the Brazilian army somewhere upriver from Manaus. Officially, the file called it research into controlled gravitational anomalies. Internal comments, in the strips that hadn't been blacked out, used a shorter term: the whole. The folder offered 3 solid facts. First, a set of coordinates inland, upriver from Manaus, near an abandoned research airstrip that had once hosted climate studies and then slipped off everyone's list. Second, an incident in the early 90s that pushed both governments to close the site and walk away. Third, a month before my flight, an illegal logging crew had vanished near the old facility, and a Brazilian satellite had picked up a cold patch where jungle and campfires should have been warm. So they pulled an old program name out of storage and handed it to me. Across from me on the bench, Lieutenant Owen Stark hooked a thumb under the chin strap of his helmet. Stark led the Special Forces detachment on loan from Fort Bragg, the usual quiet professional who measured everything in risk to his men and the weight of his ruck. Beside him, Sergeant Paul King checked a hard case of medical gear for the 3rd time. The 4th man on our side of the cabin looked like somebody had dragged him out of a lab by the collar and taped body armor to him. That file going to tell us what a gravitational anomaly looks like, Gower? Stark's mouth twitched, an almost smile. It tells me this place used to have more people on it, I said. Nobody up the chain wants their name attached to whatever's still down there. That's what bothers me. The 4th man shifted his grip on the rugged equipment case in his lap. They aren't exactly gravitational anomalies, he began. That term came from the original funding pitch. The work in Deep Well involved. I raised a hand. Plain language, Dr. Harris. You're the subject matter grown-up. I need yes or no on 3 items. Are we flying into radiation, infectious material, or anything that makes my teeth fall out in a year? Dr. Ian Harris flinched, then gathered himself. His glasses rode in frames that had seen better days. His beard hadn't committed to a shape. Academic, contracted through a Pentagon research program. Physics background with a subfield that took 3 breaths to pronounce. He'd spent the flight gripping that case with the tenderness other men saved for children. Radiation levels sit at background according to the old data, he answered. The original tests didn't use biological agents, as far as the documents admit. As for your teeth, if anyone suffered long-term effects, that stayed in classified files or graves. The most honest answer is that nobody understands the mechanism. That's the other thing that bothers me, I said. Any surprises left over from the days this was a full-time military facility? Stark answered. We brought mine-resistant boots, ground-penetrating radar, and Brazilian soldiers who used to guard the place. If anyone left a present in the ground, we'll see it before it sees us. They never went inside the door, Harris muttered. I tapped the file's edge with my thumb. Up front, the pilot made a small circle with his gloved hand. Harnesses snapped. Weapons checks rattled through the cabin. I carried a short carbine more for politics than for work. My real tools rode in my head. Habit, pattern recognition, and a talent for spotting which lie in a stack mattered most. We came down on cracked concrete that had once been a small logistics strip. Jungle pressed in on 3 sides. Old buildings sagged along the far edge, Roofs caved, weeds working into seams. The strip had no working lights anymore. Weak glow sticks marked it instead, and the angular silhouettes of Brazilian soldiers waited by a pair of trucks that had clawed their way in along the road. A stocky officer with graying hair and a row of old campaign ribbons on a faded uniform raised his hand. Colonel Paulo Almeida, Brazilian Army liaison. His English held the formal edges you pick up in staff courses. Mr. Gower, Lieutenant Stark. He shook our hands in turn. Welcome back to our forgotten corner. You've been keeping it warm for us? Stark hitched his ruck. Warm enough. Almeida looked past us toward the trees. My father was a young lieutenant when he guarded the original Deepwell bunker. He told my brothers the forest around that place listened too carefully. He worked there 3 months. After the closure, he refused to go back. That in the file? I asked. It lived in his stories. Something moved behind his eyes. More recently, a logging outfit near the site stopped answering radios. Their camper machines were gone. The tracks of their last vehicles ended where the bunker's access road used to run. My government pulled old agreements and old debts out of drawers and called yours. So here we are. What do your people call it? I asked. The site. He checked the distance to his men with a glance. The older ones call it the Gringo Hole. Then they cross themselves and change the subject. We bumped along with his escort until the track narrowed to something the trucks couldn't handle. They let us off where the undergrowth thickened and the trees rose higher, and we finished on foot. Interior jungle carries its own background noise. Insects, birds, small things moving. I'd learned that much, bouncing between insurgent camps and narco trails. As we walked toward the coordinates, the sound thinned. Fewer calls, fewer rustles. Leaves hung still. I glanced back at Harris. He walked behind King, one hand resting on the device clipped to his vest, a metal and plastic brick with a row of analog needles across the top. That your gravity finder? I asked. Portable gravimeter, he said. Measures small changes in local acceleration. It should barely move unless we're near something with serious mass. The needles slid a hair's width and settled. As we cleared a stand of taller trees, they shifted again. Not in one direction, but back and forth in tiny, fast twitches. His brow creased. These deflections make no sense, he murmured. Some of these dips line up like missing mass instead of extra. Missing, I said, watching the undergrowth ahead. Like a hole, he grimaced. Gravity doesn't make holes in that sense, at least not in models we trust. Your predecessors named this place, I reminded him. Sanity might have moved out a long time ago. We walked for more than an hour by my internal clock. Sweat turned straps into sandpaper. Almeida's 2 soldiers at point kept checking their GPS units, then each other, as if hoping the numbers would quietly move the destination somewhere else. Finally, the lead man raised a fist. We halted in a small clearing where the ground swelled into a low rise. Vines climbed over chunks of concrete. The stump of an antenna mast leaned at an angle, guy wires broken. Both Brazilian GPS units chimed. This is it, Almeida said. There used to be a hatch here. Round metal door in the ground, 2 guards on it at all times. After the closure, they sealed it and poured a low cap over the top. That cap looks different. The concrete dome had slumped at the center, as if something beneath had shifted. Cracks radiated outward, vines and roots prying them open. Stark moved closer, heels probing for hollows. If there's a void under there, the weight distribution changed, Harris said under his breath. Over time, you get collapse like this. It fits. I need eyes on the hatch, Stark decided. We dig. Entrenching tools, pry bars, a compact saw for the thicker roots passed hand to hand. Years of watching other people dig from a safe distance had never sat entirely right with me. I shrugged off my pack and joined in. Concrete broke away in reluctant slabs. Roots clung to anything solid and tore free in tangled clumps. We chipped and hauled until sweat glued shirts to our backs and dust turned to paste in the lines of our hands. Each layer revealed older metal and deeper fracture lines. King straightened long enough to wipe his forehead with a dusty wrist. You know, Gower, when I signed up as a medic, nobody mentioned archaeology. You're digging up the last time our two governments tried to be clever here, I told him. Think of it as a medical case with terrible handwriting. He snorted and went back to work. Under the last slab, our scraping met rounded steel. When we finally cleared the circle, we stood around a hatch nearly 3 meters across. American Cold War issue, thick and stubborn, once painted in screaming warning colors, now peeling in tired flakes. English letters across the surface read, "Authorized personnel only." Portuguese below repeated the threat. Corroded steel showed through most of the paint on the rim. In a few narrow bands, though, the color looked oddly fresh, edges sharp, as if decades had skipped those stripes. Between them, thin rings of bare metal showed a too clean sheen, like something had pressed against the hatch in a perfect seal and then drawn away without leaving residue. Harris knelt and touched one of the untouched bands with a fingertip, then pulled his hand back fast. Corrosion should spread more evenly, he said. This patchwork doesn't line up with any normal pattern. Chemical spill? King crouched beside him. Maybe, Harris answered, but the word lacked conviction. The symmetry bothers me. Stark glanced at me. We can mark the location, pull back and wait for engineers, or we crack it and take the first look ourselves. I thought of the missing loggers, the satellite's cold patch, the long silence in the file. I pictured trying to convince a colonel in Brasilia or Washington that the site felt wrong without being able to say why. We open it, I said. We move slowly. We log everything. If we walk into a mess, the after-action won't fit on 3 lines. He nodded once and set his hands on the locking wheel. It resisted, then grudgingly turned, metal groaning in dry bearings. As the seals parted, a strong draft brushed past us, not rising from below but sliding sideways, like air that had been holding a grudge against the outside world and finally found a gap. King wrinkled his nose, then forced his face neutral. He held a meter over the opening. Oxygen and toxins read normal. The air from the opening felt flat and thin. Tropical air usually carries moisture and smell. Even stale indoor air has a taste. This breathed like a space that had spent years apart and learned nothing from its surroundings. Stark lifted the hatch with help from 2 of his men. The opening revealed a narrow stairwell leading down into shadow. Our headlamps leaned in. The beam edges faltered. Light went in and refused to return the way it should. Not ordinary darkness, more like distance crammed into a short drop. "Welcome to Deep Well," I said mostly to myself. "Let's see what they left us." We went down single file. The stairs were plain metal, once striped in safety colors, now dulled and chipped. Our boots met each step with a muted thump. The shaft's shape should have carried sound like a bell. Instead, each impact died faster than my instincts expected, as if the concrete had been padded. Harris brushed his fingers along the wall. "This geometry should ring more," he murmured. "Sound is bleeding out too fast." "Save the geometry for the report," I told him. "Watch your feet." The stairwell opened onto a short corridor with metal doors on either side. Emergency placards in English and Portuguese reminded personnel to keep identification visible. A bulletin board by the nearest door held curling memos under yellowed plastic. The dates ran from the late 80s into the early 90s. Someone had tacked up a faded cartoon of a scientist arguing with a general over funding. Inside the first room, we found the remains of an operations center. Old monitors sat in rows on consoles. A chessboard perched on a side table, pieces mid-game, a white knight hovering between squares, frozen in indecision. Cups stood by keyboards, one tipped over, its contents long since dried into faint stains. Dust softened everything. In some spots it lay deep. In others, Sharp-edged outlines marked where objects had once rested and now were gone. A rectangle on one console traced the footprint of a removed device. A clean patch on the floor showed where a chair had stood. The borders around those empty shapes ran as straight as if someone had cut them with a blade. Harris crouched over one of the bare patches. "Whoever cleared this place worked off priorities I don't understand," he said. "They took a chair and left an entire tape deck." "Looters grab what they can carry," Stark said. "Maybe the guards wanted souvenirs they could show off." Almeida stood in the doorway. "Nobody came down here after the incident," he said quietly. "They locked the hatch and posted sentries above. My father never joked about that part." I picked up a small metal badge from the floor near a console. Concentric circles surrounded an empty center. Deep Well's logo. Someone had liked the program enough to mint pins. I turned the badge in my fingers, then slid it into a chest pocket. Evidence moved faster when it stayed where I could feel it. We swept the first level. Barracks held unmade bunks and lockers forced open. Some beds were stripped. On others, thin sheets and blankets stayed tucked with habitual care. Personal items lingered on a few shelves. Paperbacks in Portuguese, a photograph of men in front of the bunker entrance, smiling in the flat way of old film. Life here had stopped, then been abandoned. Nothing suggested later residence. In a small office, we found paper logs in a metal filing cabinet. Water had bled ink across many pages, but some entries near the back stayed legible. My finger traced lines about null volume stabilization and time domain anomaly. The handwriting grew more hurried as dates crept toward the end. Tests scheduled closer together. Joint oversight meetings dropped. In the margin of one report, a note in Portuguese caught my eye, scribbled in a different hand. Almeida leaned in. "This is Cavalcante's writing," he whispered. "One of our lead physicists." His lips formed the words. "He calls the well an awake place, not just a field they can switch off." I slid the page free and tucked it into a plastic sleeve. "Fields get turned off all the time," I said. "Places are harder to erase." We worked toward the center of the facility. In the main corridors, King and Stark coaxed a few emergency lights back to life on old battery lines. Some fixtures stayed dead. Others flickered into a dull, uneven glow. Their light painted more suggestion than detail. In several stretches, the walls showed odd damage. On one side, paint had peeled in long vertical strips, each strip parallel, like gravity had leaned sideways for a season. The opposite wall's paint remained smooth. In a maintenance alcove, a metal stool stood half swallowed by the floor. The thin rim of its circular base had sunk into the concrete and then stopped, leaving the rest hovering a centimeter above, perfectly level. No cracks radiated from the contact points. "Ordinary settling doesn't do this," Harris said. "The base looks like the floor pulled it in and held it there. Capture, not collapse." "Capture of what?" he kept to himself. By the time we reached the heavy door at the deepest point of the main corridor, the bunker felt like it had held its breath for years. The door itself belonged in some manual called Last Things to Close. Thick steel, circular, multiple locking bars braced across it. Radiation symbols and magnetic hazard triangles ringed its edge. A message hand-painted across the top ran in both languages. "Do not open without authorization from both commands." The observation window beside the door showed a spider web of stress marks but hadn't shattered. Harris aimed his light through it. The beam entered the glass, slipped into the chamber beyond, and simply went away. No walls emerged. No dust motes lit up. The interior returned nothing at all. "Even in a dark room, light scatters," he said. "We should see at least a hint of the beam, or a glow on air particles. This gives us nothing." "Maybe they coated the window," Stark suggested. "Coatings don't make a beam vanish," Harris replied. On the other side of the glass, the light stopped behaving like light. I'd been in caves and silos. Darkness always has texture, a sense of distance, hints of shape. This felt like staring through a doorway onto absence. "Command wants us to verify what's inside," I said. "They won't accept the glass feels wrong as a conclusion. We open it. We stay on this side of the threshold. We test." Stark worked the manual release. The wheel fought him, then slid. Bars shuddered back. The door opened a handspan, then two. Past the frame, the world lost its familiar markers. No visible floor, ceiling, or walls, only a perfectly uniform black region that swallowed orientation. Our beams crossed the plane and dissolved. They didn't dim with distance or bounce. The stream of light simply had a clean end where visibility stopped. Air moved past us from the chamber. It carried neither warmth nor chill, just a blank, hollow quality. The small muscles along my arms and neck tightened on their own, the body's answer to weather it couldn't name. The door's frame belonged firmly to our side. Everything beyond its plane felt like somewhere else. "Doctor?" I asked. Harris stood rigid, eyes locked on the gap. "If this holds up," he said, "they created a region where normal time and energy hardly change. A controlled volume where entropy barely shifts. But it doesn't behave like a simple cavity. It acts more like a well." "Then we find out how deep it goes," I told him, ignoring the part of me that wanted the door sealed and concrete poured. "On our terms, not the loggers." We dragged a small equipment cart into the antechamber and turned it into an ugly experiment platform. Harris argued for elegance. Stark and I argued for simplicity. We bolted a metal pole to the floor on a pivot. The far end held a cluster of instruments scavenged from shelves and from Harris's case. A camera, a thermometer, a pressure sensor, a small rack of mechanical strain gauges. A braided rope tied to the tip would let us haul it back if anything locked. "If the well really holds things near fixed entropy," Harris said, "the instruments might lock at their entry readings. That tells us how it treats state variables." "I want to know if it chews up anything that touches it," Stark said. "That's my variable." We swung the pole until its tip hovered a meter from the doorway. King braced the pivot with his shoulder. Stark wrapped another rope around his wrist. I counted us in. The tip crossed the frame. From where we stood, the metal simply vanished beyond the plane. The portion on our side remained solid and ordinary. The segment inside the chamber lost all visible presence, like we'd pushed it into a perfectly cut recess. The camera feed that had shown the antechamber wall jumped to a flat, uniform black. The thermometer reading on Harris's laptop snapped to a single value and held there without a flicker. The pressure sensor and the simple mechanical gauges did the same. Their traces flattened into ruler straight lines. No jitter, no drift. "This shouldn't be possible," Harris whispered. "Real instruments always wander a little. There's always noise." "Maybe the well irons it out," King said. We pulled the pole back. As I steadied the pivot, my glove rode up and my bare wrist grazed the frame. It slid as smoothly as it had gone in. No extra weight, no resistance. The metal that had gone through reappeared in our world as if from behind a curtain. Its surface now carried fine, branching patterns, like frost etched in fractal veins. When the thermometer touched it, the reading stayed glued to the same number. King pressed warm, bare fingers to the metal. The temperature readout refused to budge. "If I had a proper lab," Harris's voice thinned away. "You've got a bunker in the jungle and my patience," I said. "What do we know?" "That whatever lies beyond that frame doesn't shred matter on contact," he answered. "It holds it in a very specific state." His eyes went back to the opening. "Living tissue might obey the same rules." Before I could shut that door in his head, one of Almeida's younger soldiers drifted too close to the physical one. His name patch read Nito. He'd been quiet all day, rifle at low ready, eyes everywhere but the void. He took one step nearer than he should have. "Back off!" Stark snapped, reaching for him. The warning hit home. Nato flinched backward, overcorrected, and his hand slid against the frame. His fingers passed through the plane up to the knuckles. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then the part of his hand past the plane lost all color. The skin didn't blanch so much as empty. Every cell looked flattened, like an anatomy chart inked onto a glove. NATO jerked back and let out a raw, tearing sound. His hand came free with a razor-straight line across the middle of his palm. Everything beyond that line stayed paper white, skin texture frozen mid-grab. The rest of him flushed with blood and panic. He dropped to his knees, clutching the limb to his chest. Blood spilled from the living portion, welling fast around the impossible edge. The white section stayed dry. King reached him first. He pried the arm away, stripping a tourniquet from his kit as he moved. Stark pinned Neto's shoulders. Almeida grabbed his legs. Neto pressed his head against the corridor wall, voice breaking as Portuguese tore out of him in a rush. King studied the hand with quick touches and a small probe. He pressed a needle thinner than a hair into the pale skin. The point refused to dimple the surface. Neto didn't flinch. "This tissue isn't responding," King said. "It isn't rotting, and it isn't circulating. The vessels feel full, but there's no pulse. This part of him doesn't belong to his body anymore." "Can whatever's happening crawl farther up?" I asked. "You want to test that inside his chest?" King shot back. "We cut above where the flesh still listens to his blood. Now." Almeida froze. His face ran through all the arithmetic in a second. Loyalty, fear, duty, history. Then he nodded once. "Do it," he said. We turned the corridor into an improvised surgical space. King prepped a small bone saw, an anesthetic. Neto begged and cursed and pleaded, words scraping raw. Almeida bent close to him, murmuring in his ear and gripping his free hand until the knuckles whitened. Stark anchored his upper body. I knelt by his shoulders, out of King's way, hands on his harness. King made the cut above the unnatural border, into flesh that still flushed and bled and twitched. The saw rasped through bone. Neto's scream climbed and then softened as drugs crawled through his system. Blood sprayed, then slowed to a leak King could manage. He clamped vessels, wrapped the stump, turned catastrophe into a wound. The severed hand lay where it fell, fingers half-curled, locked in that last spasm. The skin stayed exactly as it had been the moment it touched the well. No blood seeped from the cut surface. The muscles held their arrested strain. It looked like a prop cast in something stubborn. Harris watched with hollow eyes. "Near zero entropy," he said, almost to himself. "A region where matter and energy drift so little that change barely counts. They actually built it." "Your predecessors actually built it," I said. "We're the ones who opened the door." While King stabilized Neto, I searched the control alcove beside the big door. A metal shelf held reel-to-reel tapes in dusty boxes. Labels marked dates and test numbers in cramped ink. I grabbed the last one before the date stopped and passed it to Harris. King carried a small battery-powered reel-to-reel player in his pack. "Music for flights," he'd said. We cleared space on a table, patched the player into a power lead, and fed the tape through. A man's voice came through the speakers, American, middle-aged, worn thin. He recited test numbers and equipment serials, referenced subject limbs held at near-zero entropy, and stable time-neutral space in the core volume. He mentioned arguments with Brazilian partners about safety. The word exposure came up more than once. "We have confirmation that tissues placed partly in the well remain viable when withdrawn," the voice reported. Volunteers described dissociation and a sense that time slid. Brazilian command is more and more concerned after what happened with animals and with some of their guards. They're pushing for shutdown. Paper rustled near the mic. The man's tone dropped closer to confession. "We built something we don't understand," he said. "Every instinct says this sits on the edge of physics, not just defense. My Brazilian counterpart, Cavalcante, calls it a door to a place where change doesn't matter. He's convinced it's awake." The recording cut off mid-word. The tape itself ran to the end. "Did you hear any mention of a safe limit?" Stark leaned back. "I heard desperation," Harris said. I pulled the satellite handset from my pack. It crawled up through a relay at the airstrip, a Brazilian uplink, and whatever secure satellite path someone in Florida had budgeted. A duty officer at the command cell patched me to a man one rank above me, whose voice I knew from conference calls, the expendable layer above people who mattered. I laid it out, the chamber, the way the probe behaved, NATO's hand, the tape. I made sure to include that a Brazilian soldier had already paid in flesh. I didn't mention how my skin still remembered that draft from the void. The voice on the other end listened, then started asking questions, mostly technical. He sharpened when I mentioned stable material and living tissue. "You're sure the preserved segment doesn't decay?" he asked. "The metal shows no change since contact," I said. "The severed hand is still fresh and dry in all the wrong ways. And partial exposure on a living subject didn't kill him. We amputated in time. He's alive." "Continue controlled tests," the voice said. "No human entry into the chamber. Gather data on material behavior. Washington will assemble a dedicated team. We need samples and hard numbers when they arrive." "What about the Brazilian casualty?" I asked. "Their colonel is deciding whether to shut us down himself." A pause stretched just long enough to deliver its own answer. "Maintain cooperation," he said. "Stress the joint nature of the work. This site is too important to lose access over one injury. Withdraw only if you lose control of the situation." The line clicked off. I lowered the handset. King was finishing NATO's bandage. Almeida stood nearby, empty hands twitching. "What does your command say?" he asked. "They want us to keep testing," I said. "No entries. Probes only, strictly controlled. We work with instruments until the bigger team lands." "And my soldier?" "They know," I said. "They expect us to treat it as a joint accident." "Of course they do." Harris hovered near the threshold, arms folded. "We've already proved what this thing does," he said. "We should close the door for good. If the boundary slips, we won't have a model. None of us belongs here." Stark checked his rifle out of habit more than need. "You want someone else to open it without us?" he asked. His tone stayed almost light. The weight under it wasn't. "They'll send another team. Might be better if the first ones to lose flesh help write the rules." Almeida's hand clenched. "You talk about rules while my man lies on your floor with one hand missing." I stepped between them. "Our job is to understand this place enough that nobody stumbles into it blind," I said. "Right now, that job sits on us. If we walk away and hand it to some future group, they'll run the same experiments and add their own mistakes. We owe NATO and whoever died here last time at least a map of the real edges." Harris studied me. "Is that duty talking?" he asked. "Or curiosity wearing a badge?" We held each other's gaze. I'd spent years chasing patterns in insurgent propaganda and cartel finances, tracking the structures people built to hide ugly things. Deep Well was uglier than anything on my desk. Walking away felt like leaving a crime scene before taking measurements. "Call it a bad mix of both," I said. "Either way, we're the ones in the room." Almeida stared at the open gap. "If you start sending people into that," he said, "one of them must be Brazilian. I'm not letting you treat my country as landlord only." "We're not sending anybody in," Harris said quickly. I looked at the severed hand on the floor, at the pole we'd dipped, at the tape deck that had carried its confession across decades. I looked at the door and the absence beyond it, which held my attention like an open elevator shaft. "We're staying on this side," I said. "No one crosses the plane by choice, not now. We use tethers, strict limits, every safety measure we can improvise, but we need to see what this does to people. There's no way to dodge that forever." Harris looked like he hadn't expected that from me. King's shoulders sagged. Stark scanned his team and gave a small nod. "I'll pick them," he said. "Volunteers only." We ended up with 3. Neil, one of Stark's other operators, and a Brazilian soldier who stepped forward before Almeida could speak. King stayed on this side to watch their vitals. The Brazilian volunteer was older than Neto, with eyes that had seen enough years in uniform to accept one more bad choice. We spent an hour turning a patrol into a tether system. Harnesses crossed chests and thighs. Double lines clipped to anchored winches and manual belays. Sensor rigs strapped to their vests. Heart rate monitors, oxygen saturation, analog stopwatches with fat hands. Short-range radios rode on chest straps, wired to an external relay that might or might not talk through the well. "If anything feels wrong, you say it," King told them as he tightened buckles. "You back out at the first excuse. Nobody proves anything in there. You come back breathing." "Heroes are the first names on the memorial wall," Stark said. "We're not hanging one here." They lined up at the threshold. Their tethers ran back to the winches where the rest of us waited. I checked each line myself, fingers on knots and clips. "This is a mistake," Harris murmured beside me. "I prefer measured risk," I said. "That phrase has buried a lot of people." On my count, the 3 stepped together. From our point of view, their change came in one brutal cut. One instant they stood on our side, boots on concrete, lines leading from their harnesses. The next, as their centers crossed the door's plane, their bodies vanished. The rope stayed taut, pointing into nothing. The monitors on our table spiked with the initial movement, then flattened. Heart rates, breathing, brainwaves, all 3 sets of traces settled into perfectly smooth lines. Their body temperatures froze at the values each man carried across. "These graphs look like someone drew them with a ruler," Harris said. "Living systems always wobble." Stark gave Neil's line a careful tug. The rope answered with the pull you'd expect from a body attached at the other end, but it refused to shift. "Neil, copy?" I spoke into his radio. Silence. Stark keyed the second radio. "Check in." Nothing. On the Brazilian net, Almeida called his man by name. The channel stayed dead. "Signal's getting eaten," Harris said. "Whatever's inside is smothering the radio link." "Then we line up a camera," I said. We mounted a small camera on a slender boom arm and angled it just inside the door, lens pointed along the inner face of the boundary instead of straight in. If we couldn't see head-on, maybe we'd catch a sideways slice. The monitor showed static, then stabilized into an image from an oblique angle. The 3 men hung a step beyond our world, suspended mid-stride. Their harness lines stretched deeper in. Limbs held positions they'd never finished. Neil's gloved hand reached forward, fingers curled halfway. His eyes were open. We watched, holding our breath. After a long, silent hour, I saw movement. Neil's left eye rotated the barest fraction. The shift took so long that at first I took it for noise on the feed. It wasn't. It was an eye tracking something through syrup. "He's alive," I said. "They all are. Their time just crawls." Harris leaned closer. "Inside the chamber, time runs at a different rate," he said. "Processes go forward, but at a pace we read as near stop." Almeida stared at his frozen soldier and lurched toward the door. Stark and I moved together. We grabbed his vest and dragged him back. He fought with sudden strength, muscles locked. "That is my man," he said. "You put him in there. I won't leave him hanging." "If you cross that frame, you join him," I said. "You won't help him from inside." He sagged after a moment, anger draining into something raw. His eyes stayed fixed on the monitor. "How do we get them out?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Harris said. "Pulling might do nothing or might tear them. We have no way to predict it." "So they stay frozen in that step forever?" Almeida's voice shook. "Not forever," I said. "We record them as alive, trapped in an anomalous state, and we force Washington and Brasilia to keep them on paper. If we write them off as dead, they become acceptable losses. If they stay listed as living, as ongoing, They stay a problem somebody has to keep facing. Harris looked at me like I'd grown a second head. You want to turn them into paperwork? I want to use bureaucracy like a crowbar, I said. That's what I know how to swing. Unless you can drag them out with equations today, that's the tool we have. We made a decision that day I'd spend years taking apart. We logged the 3 men as living casualties, suspended in an anomalous condition. We wrote a narrative around the chamber, dangerous but containable under strict protocols. We pushed that upward. We stayed on site. We kept the door usable. That night, while King watched over Neto and Almeida stalked between his remaining men as if they might vanish, while Harris replayed the same graphs until pixels blurred, I went back to the control alcove. I sat on an old crate and watched the side view feed. Neil hung there, arm reaching, eyes open, trapped in the moment I'd ordered him into. The thought lodged behind my ribs and refused to budge. A day later, after shift sleep and tasteless rations and too many passes over the same data, Harris came to me with a jittery kind of focus. I looked at Nato's biopsy, he said. When we cut above the affected area, we took a small sample. The tissue near the border shows microstructural changes. We sat in the barracks with an open logbook between us. The rest of the team moved like ghosts. Plain language, I said. Think of 3 zones. The part fully in the well is locked. The part fully out behaves like normal flesh. At the interface, things run slow without freezing. The cells line up in ways ordinary tissue doesn't. You're saying the edge is different from the middle? Yes. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. If somebody spent time partly in contact with that border, the cells there might adapt. That's speculation, but the biopsy hints in that direction. And we use that how? He held my gaze in a way I didn't enjoy. When we hauled the probe back the first time, your glove rode up and the frame brushed your wrist, remember? Memory offered a brief absence of sensation. My hand sliding past metal and feeling nothing at all. I remember. You may have the same microscopic changes at those skin layers, he said. If we could study, you're thinking like a scientist, I cut in. Tell me what this means in practice. It might let you move in the well under slightly different rules than the others, he said. Someone already touched by the boundary might interact with it differently. Or it does nothing. Also possible. He didn't look away. But 3 men are trapped in there, and Command wants more data. You want your people back. This is the only vector I see. I knew better than to make decisions tired and cornered. I'd watched officers ruin entire districts that way. I'd spent years telling myself I operated differently. Command hadn't answered our last full report yet. We sat in a space where nobody above me had said yes or no to anything. If I asked, I'd get delay, then denial, then orders to sit tight until major league teams flew in and took this away. I didn't ask. We rig a single entry harness, I said. Door open only while I'm on tether. You watch every gauge. My only task is contact. I find the lines, see whether they have any give, and come back. Recon, not rescue. You're not qualified for this, he said. Nobody else on this continent is qualified either. At least I know I'm stubborn. Pick someone you trust to watch my line. He picked King. Stark glared but held his tongue. We suited up. The harness wrapped my chest, shoulders and thighs, and a respirator sealed over my face. Redundant tethers with integrated comms lines clipped to anchors sunk into the antechamber floor. A sensor pack rode on my back, cables running to a box near my right wrist. Harris tested the feed twice. Vitals, orientation. Haptic buzzers at my elbows and knees, wired to the sensor pack to tap coded signals if the field shifted around me. You go 1 meter in, Harris said over the line. Stop, count to 10, report, then another meter, stay on the tether. If anything feels strange and you can't explain it in 1 sentence, you turn around. That covers most of my career, I said. Stark clipped the last carabiner. You sure about this? No, I said. That's why it's me. Overly optimistic people forget they're doing something stupid. I stepped up to the threshold. The inner door stood partway open. The black beyond looked exactly as it had before. The frame's plane sliced the world into ours and whatever that region counted as. I eased my gloved hand into the boundary until sensation dropped away on the far side. "Telemetry looks clean," Harris said behind me. "All lines steady, whenever you're ready." I leaned into the gap. The world dropped its anchors. Inside the chamber, direction unraveled. Up, down, left, right. None of it came with the usual cues. I knew I had a body only because straps wrapped my chest and thighs, and the tether tugged at my waist. My breathing rattled in my ears for a few cycles, then slid away as if distance had stretched between sound and perception. When I moved an arm, the response lagged, like I was pushing through dense gel. Time lost its yardstick. If someone had asked how long it took to reach the first tether line, I wouldn't have had an answer. Thoughts moved alongside my motions, but their relation to seconds outside had snapped. My fingers struck something solid. I recoiled, then reached forward with more care. A sleeve, fabric. Under it, an arm held rigid. I traced it to a shoulder, then a chest, then a helmet. "Kneel," I tried. My own voice felt like a thought, not a sound. I took hold of his harness and pulled. His body resisted, as if the medium itself had wrapped him. No weight, but no movement either. I braced my boots against what felt like another suspended shape, and heaved. Nothing. As I worked, awareness of other forms seeped in. To my left, a different fabric, rougher. My hand slid along a sleeve to a stitched patch on a shoulder. The outline of a flag. United States. To my right, a lab coat. Under it, bone frozen mid-twist. The well had been collecting history. Brazilian guards from decades ago, American scientists, other bodies I couldn't easily sort. All hung in the same invisible syrup. I followed the main tethers by feel, hand over hand, trying to ignore how the line sometimes seemed to curve in ways my inner ear rejected. Up and down blurred into each other. Boundaries between past and present felt thin. For an extended instant, a mechanical klaxon wailed in my head, the harsh kind older systems love. Faces flashed, strangers, mouths wide, neck veins standing, shouting. Then the impressions stretched and slid away like images printed on rubber and pulled out of shape. Piece by piece, I understood that time in the well didn't run at one fixed rate. Some things crawled, some smeared. Events from different entry moments leaned across one another. The haptic buzzers on my arms fired in the pattern we'd agreed meant, "Come back." The taps arrived spaced so far apart they felt like separate decisions. If I kept going, I might never find my way out. That thought carried no urgency. Urgency needs a sense of time. Here, everything stayed distant. The thought came with a cold clarity instead. I let go of Neil's harness and turned onto my own line. Hand over hand, I pulled along the tether, forcing my arms to keep moving as the medium thickened around them. At some point, the resistance at my face peeled away. The doorframe clipped my shoulder. I stumbled onto concrete. Sound slammed back into my ears. Lights, people, equipment, voices. After the well's muffled whirled, the antechamber hit like a stadium. Stark caught my harness. King crouched, scanning my face. Harris hovered with a clipboard clutched in both hands. I lay there until my lungs remembered how to work at normal speed. "You were gone almost a day," Harris told me later, when I could sit upright. "From our side, the door stayed open. Your tether stayed taut. Your vitals flattened like the others. Only when the gradient near the frame shifted did your pattern start to wander again, and then you came back." Outside, while I drifted among frozen men and stretched alarms, helicopters had landed. Engineers had hauled in gear. Communications towers had risen. Our small team had turned into the seed of a program. When they brought me topside, the jungle around the bunker had been chewed back. Generators thumped on concrete pads. Tents ringed a new perimeter. More Brazilian soldiers guarded the approach. New American faces moved between them. Patches I recognized from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and some I'd never seen. Colonel George Windsor met me near the clearing's edge. US Army, tall, spare, eyes that read problems instead of faces. His handshake was brief. "Mr. Gower," he said, "you've complicated my life. Happy to keep you employed, Colonel." He walked me to a prefab admin hut and debriefed with efficient questions. Distances, sensations, the spread of frozen bodies, any sense of how the tether behaved. Harris backed my account with logs full of flat lines and spikes. Windsor listened. He didn't accuse us of embellishing. The evidence sat under his boots in the shape of a chamber that ate time. Deepwell had new owners, wearing patches from organizations that thought in terms of weapons and containment. Over the next days, scaffolding went up around the inner door. Sensors sprouted along the corridor. Heavy shielding grew in concentric rings. In a side room, Harris ran a small lab where Neto's preserved hand sat in a transparent frame, still perfect in all the wrong ways. Beside it, the metal from our first probe rested on a padded mount, its frost patterns unchanged even as they shifted temperature and atmosphere around it. A visitor from a defense research agency spent an afternoon walking through the lab. He wore ore like a formality, then started talking about field-stabilized storage and kinetic damping grids, as if he already saw slide decks. "They'll turn this into hardware," Harris said quietly afterward. "They'll act as if the living system part is a separate problem. They'll tell themselves they can fence off the dangerous sections and tap the gentle edges," I said. "That story's older than any of us." Almeida moved at the margins of the expanded operation, his role trimmed by orders from Brasilia. Some of his superiors wanted the entire site buried. Others wanted a front-row seat if the Americans shaped the well into a tool. His men grew restless. Some refused to go below. Rumors drifted through camp that the forest around the bunker felt wrong. Brazilian biologists attached to the mission had data to feed those rumors. They sampled vegetation near the site and farther out. Leaves from plants near the bunker felt stiffer. Growth rings in small branches looked compressed and distorted. A few insects dug from soil by drainage grates arrived in a peculiar state. Legs and antennae froze mid-crawl. Yet under a microscope, the cells still counted as technically alive. "The well is bleeding," Harris muttered over those slides. "Its influence is leaking into the surrounding volume. The transition zone is growing." "Slowly," I said. "Until someone kicks the boundary again," he answered. My own medical tests came back with notes the doctors didn't say loudly. Blood work looked fine. Heart, lungs, brain scans all sat within expected ranges. Detailed imaging of my extremities, though, showed subtle changes in tissue near the skin. The radiologist wrote phrases like unusual ordering and non-standard orientation in the margins. Nobody had a reference. I started losing track of time in small ways. Sometimes I'd focus on a report, then look up and find an hour missing. Other times, a dropped pen would fall in stages, every small change in position exaggerated, my mind tracking each step while the wall clock ticked along at its usual pace. The episodes came and went. I didn't report everyone. I didn't trust what a committee would decide to do with that detail. Instead, I kept my own list and told myself it stayed under control. Windsor called a meeting in the old control room one evening. Electrical panels hummed. Monitors showed camera feeds, graphs, vitals. "Washington has given guidance," he said, hands on the back of a chair. "Deep Well is now a joint anomalous containment and research site. First mission, keep the phenomenon stable. Second, understand the boundary well enough to use its peripheral effects for containment and defense." I raised an eyebrow at use. He didn't blink. "We also have one person who can return from inside," he went on, looking at me. "Your excursion proved that, Mr. Gower. That makes you an asset." "You make it sound like another training course," I said. "You'll act as liaison between the scientific team and command," he said. "In practice, that means more controlled entries. We need mapping data on how the field behaves at different distances and configurations. We also need any route that might bring our men back without ripping them apart." "So you want me back in the well?" I said. "We're not going to force you," Windsor said. The second half of the sentence didn't need words. "You've already taken risks beyond your brief, but if you agree, you'll have a voice in procedures and authority to push back on dangerous ideas." "And if I turn this down?" He didn't answer directly. We both knew volunteers would appear. Or volunteers. My choices had helped drag us here. I could pretend they mattered less than the decisions made by dead scientists and distant generals, but in the quiet part of my mind, I knew better. "I'll go back in," I said, "on the condition that every entry has a clear objective, a hard time limit, and veto from both me and Harris if the risk climbs too high." "Agreed," Windsor said. Harris looked torn between arguing and thanking me. He settled for a glare. The second entry came 2 days later. This time they strapped on more hardware. Extra sensors, haptics at wrists and ankles tied to external field monitors. If the gradient shifted, they'd buzz patterns meant to hint which direction felt safer. I doubted my brain would pass that cleanly through the well's syrup, but elegance had long since left the building. On paper, the mission focused on field mapping. Move in straight lines, stop at set intervals, report resistance, drop reflective markers on thin tethers at different depths. Unofficially, I carried one private objective. I couldn't shake the image of Neil hanging there. I had ordered him into that state. If I walked away without trying a real recovery, caution stopped sounding like prudence and started sounding like an excuse. We opened the inner door. Scaffolding creaked. Cameras watched from 3 angles. Windsor stood in the control alcove, arms folded. Almeida stayed close to the medical station. Harris hovered at the consoles. "Remember the plan," Harris said through my earpiece. "No freelancing." "I remember," I said, and stepped through. The transition felt the same, a sharp cut from air to medium. The buzzers started low, a steady pattern matching the baseline the team outside expected. I moved forward, following the pull of the tether and the faint sense of direction the haptics provided, more like reading pressure than following a compass. At intervals, I let small reflective markers spool out on their lines, anchoring bits of our world inside a place that didn't care. Eventually, my hand brushed Neil's sleeve again, then the straps across his chest. His body temperature under the suit matched the entry reading. When I felt for a pulse at his neck, a slow rhythm answered, stretched but present. Time hadn't rescued him. The written plan called for me to note his position and move on. The plan in my head ended differently. I planted my boots against something solid. Equipment, another frozen figure I couldn't tell. I wrapped my hand around his forearm just above the elbow. The tether pulled at my waist in the direction I thought of as home. If I could drag any part of him across the boundary, maybe ordinary time would grab hold again. I started to pull. Resistance pressed back from all directions. It didn't feel like mass. It felt like the medium itself pushing. Effort didn't make me sweat, it just thickened the world. The tether bit into my waist. Outside, Neil's arm emerged through the doorway to the mid-forearm. For the space of a breath, the flesh on our side looked normal. Skin tone, pores, hairs. Then the mismatch caught up in a violent spasm. The exposed forearm turned paper white and locked in place. The seam stayed razor straight at the plane. Alarms squealed on the consoles. Sensor lines spiked. The air near the door shimmered with a slow, heat haze ripple. Dust in the corridor stopped drifting and hung in place. A wrench slipped from a technician's hand and halted mid-fall, half a meter down. "The boundary's advancing," Harris said. "It's pushing into the corridor." Pockets of stillness bulged out from the main plane, blooming along the floor and walls. One caught a Brazilian technician as he tried to retreat. His torso jerked, arms windmilling, face twisting. Everything from the waist down locked in place, one boot planted, the other just off the floor. The seam between ordinary time and the still zone ran straight through muscle and bone. Another pocket swallowed a threat reduction specialist's hand and forearm. The flesh turned hard and white. The wrench he'd dropped hovered close to his frozen fingers. Almeida grabbed a nearby soldier by his harness and yanked him backward as the man's heel grazed a new forming patch. Leather and tread flashed that familiar, deadened look, but the leg itself cleared the border. Inside, I felt the change as turbulence. New blocks grew in the medium. Limbs that crossed them went numb and stuck until I forced a different path. One such region sliced through my right leg above the knee. Sensations stopped dead. My brain kept sending commands. Nothing answered. Outside, Harris yelled for the door, and Windsor took in the corridor with one look. Trapped men, creeping shimmer. A growing chance the field would walk its way into the whole bunker. "Seal it," he ordered. The heavy wheel spun. The door swung, carrying the main boundary plane with it. As it moved, it cut through some of the still pockets like a blade. Sections of concrete and gear and trapped bodies sheared away, left lining the inner edge like glass shards. My tether jerked backward with more force than any human grip. People on the outside had thrown their weight into hauling. I grabbed the line and pulled too, dragging with my arms while my right leg remained an unresponsive length stuck in a zone that refused motion. At my thigh, something gave. The sensation didn't read as pain at first. It felt like a line drawn clean across where the world still flowed and where it didn't. Hands seized my harness and shoulders. I felt them in my ribs and collarbones. They dragged me backward through the plane and onto the floor. Pain arrived as soon as the rest of me came back into the same time. It didn't come from the lower leg. That segment still felt absent. It flared from the stump where circulation still acted like I owned flesh. Someone called for a saw. For an instant, I thought of Neil's arm. Then I caught up. "If we leave his leg tied into that zone, it will pull," Harris said. "He'll anchor it. We sever the connection now." Windsor's face swam into view above me. He took in my leg, the numb segment still jutting through the frame into the thin slice of lingering field, the deadened color creeping upward. He nodded once. King, pale but steady, took the bone saw from an assistant. "Gower," he said, leaning close. "We're out of options." I looked down. From mid-thigh down, my leg still extended into the frame, skin and cloth at the edge gone flat and wrong. I felt nothing below a certain point. The idea of that emptiness climbing any higher made the choice straightforward. "Cut," I said. They cinched a tourniquet above the numb border. Drugs found a vein. The world narrowed. When I woke in a hospital ward in Manaus, my right leg ended above the knee under thick bandages. Phantom feelings marched down the missing length. Itch with nowhere to scratch. Ache where no bone lay. Sometimes it felt as if the lower half still stretched away into some unreachable place. A DIA handler from Washington visited. A man in a suit with a notebook and a careful smile. He took my account of the second entry and steered gently when I described grabbing Neil's arm. "The official narrative will cast your actions as a push to gather critical data under pressure," he said. "You followed mission parameters, reacted to an emergent threat, and volunteered as a test subject with a clear understanding of risk. That's the version the system can carry. And the version where I hung onto Neil's arm long enough to help trigger that field spread?" I asked. "That version goes in a deeper file," he said. "Not to spare you. If we start carving blame that precisely, the program collapses into investigations and hearings. We need Deepwell contained and studied. That won't happen if every officer spends the next decade in court. Good to know my place." "Your place," he said, then winced at his own word choice, "is as the one person who's been inside and come back more than once. That makes you relevant." Families of the lost received their letters. Weeks later, headquarters reclassified the suspended men as dead on paper. They were told their sons or husbands had died in an accident during training for a classified mission. Circumstances prevented recovery of remains. The work had saved lives. Their sacrifices would be honored. In truth, their bodies hung in a region where time crawled, arms reaching, eyes moving by fractions that nobody at home would ever see. No letter could make that sit comfortably with "died in an accident." Therapy blurred together with more time slips. Some days, sessions with parallel bars and weighted bands dragged on forever. Other days, I'd start brushing my teeth and look up to find half an hour gone, toothbrush flattened. Sometimes nurses walked past in small jerks, each step segmented, while the clock at the end of the ward ticked along with cheerful indifference. One afternoon, I watched a plastic cup tumble from an orderly's hand. It fell in discrete stages, pausing between positions as if the world had turned into a flipbook. The impact sound arrived a half-beat late. Nobody else even blinked. Whatever the well had done at the border of my skin had brushed my perception too. I wasn't blessed. I wasn't chosen. I was contaminated. Months later, once the stump healed and I'd learned to walk with a prosthetic, they flew me north under a false name. The plane delivered me to a research campus hiding behind a boring fence somewhere far from jungle. The buildings looked like every other federal complex. Rows of windows, controlled doors, landscaping approved by committee. Deep Well lived here in a different body. The lab they took me to sat in a reinforced basement. Thick concrete, steel, shielding. 2 security checkpoints and 2 heavy doors led to a room with armored glass along one wall. Behind the glass, on a raised platform, a large metal ring stood like sculpture. Inside it, held by clamps that bit into the surrounding material, hovered a vertical slice that set every nerve on edge. They called it the segment. Engineers had cut it out of the bunker during containment. Wall, field, everything. A captured section of the boundary. From floor to above my head, the plane of the captured well cut through concrete, rebar, insulation, and the remains of a human leg. My leg. The part of the limb trapped in the plane, from mid-thigh down, hung there in cross-section. Muscles, bone, connective tissue. Every layer visible along the line where the saw at the bunker had separated me from that zone. The flesh on the far side of the boundary had frozen into that moment and stayed. I recognized an old scar near the ankle from a training injury years back. It looked fresh. The toenails needed clipping. Technicians in lab coats moved around the ring, guiding instruments on articulated arms. They kept every solid object shy of the plane. They measured field gradients, energy damping, micro-vibrations. When they tapped nearby frames, graphs showed sudden drops in kinetic energy near the segment. "You're using my leg as padding," I said. One of the senior scientists, a thin man with steady eyes, glanced over. "The captured plane is the important part," he said. "Your limb is just material that happened to be in the cut. The effect is the same through concrete or flesh." "That's one way to frame it," I said. A senior official met me in a glassed office afterward. No uniform, just a dark suit, and the relaxed posture of someone used to this kind of conversation. "Mr. Gower," he began, "you've been reassigned here as a consultant on anomalous containment. Your field experience and what you've lived through at Deep Well put you in a unique position to help. And as a test subject," I said. "There will be medical monitoring," he said. "We'd be negligent not to study long-term effects. But that isn't your main role. You can read scientists' reports, translate them into language decision-makers can act on, and catch behavioral risks equations ignore. You understand how far people will push when they think they've found a new tool. And if I walk away? You retire," he said. "You live on disability under a non-disclosure that cuts your dinner conversation down to weather. The work here continues with people who've never felt the well on their own skin. The phenomenon doesn't care either way. It will sit where it sits until the planet fails or we find a way to break it." Later, Harris joined me by the observation window. He'd transferred up here as well, deep well had gotten under his skin too. "They'll push experiments whether you're here or not," he said, leaning on the rail. "They'll knock on that plane and see how hard they can hit before something jumps. You know the pattern." "I do." "If you're in the room, you might notice things others miss," he said. "Those time slips of yours, your gut sense of the field. We don't understand it, but it might give you a kind of intuition. You could be an early warning. Or just another pair of hands helping them pry," I said. He gave a tired half smile. "Those jobs overlap more than we like." When he left, I stayed. Behind the glass, the preserved part of my leg hung framed by the ring, lit in cold lab light. It managed to look both grotesque and mundane, like a teaching aid that had wandered into the wrong classroom. A faint sensation stirred in the stump under my pant leg. Not pain or phantom itch, more like a tug from somewhere just out of reach. On impulse, I rolled my chair closer. I lifted my left hand and pressed my palm flat to the armored glass opposite where my right foot floated on the far side. The world hesitated. The technician in the back corner froze mid-step. A droplet slipped from his water bottle and hung, a small globe, bending the light around it into tiny rainbows. The second hand on the wall clock paused, then crept a fraction. On the other side of the window, monitors lining a rack spiked. The trace that mapped the boundary's profile flared, the edge pushing a fraction of a millimeter farther into the room before settling back. Then everything moved again. The droplet hit the floor. The technician muttered and wiped it up. The clock ticked on. The lab hummed. I lifted my hand. My stump tingled. No siren sounded. Nobody burst in to ask if I'd felt anything. Only the graphs knew something had shifted, and the techs weren't watching for that exact shape yet. I could have called Harris in that second. I could have walked straight into the office and written up the event. Instead, I sat there and let the choice roll around my mind. The well had taken my men and my leg. It had killed and maimed and left pieces of people embedded in concrete. Now it sat here, in a ring behind glass, a wound we'd decided to observe instead of cauterize, assuming cauterizing was even possible. I told myself staying close meant I could blunt the worst impulses. Confronting monsters from behind glass instead of from a jungle trail was still confronting them. That was the story I tried on. It fit well enough. When the senior official came back the next day to ask whether I was ready to start work, I nodded. "I'm in," I said. "On two conditions. I get full access to all logs from the first deep well program, Brazilian and American, and I have a say in every experiment that involves living subjects." "We aren't planning to put anybody into the segment," he said. "Plans change," I said. "Put it in writing." He hesitated, then agreed. Paper armor is thin, but it beats bare skin. In the weeks that followed, I sat in a quiet office reading old logs while, behind glass, technicians tapped and measured the captured boundary. I learned that during the first deep well, men told themselves the same story. Understand the thing, keep it safe, put it to controlled use. The well didn't care. It remained what it was, a place where change meant something different, waiting for whatever we lowered into it. Sometimes, walking past the observation window, I'd see my preserved leg in the ring and feel that faint pull, as if part of me still leaned toward the other side. I'd look at the metal, the sensors, the people in their coats and wonder how long we could balance curiosity, fear, and appetite before something slipped. The logs had nothing useful to say about that. Some stories end with lessons. This one ends with an image. A piece of me anchored in a plane that refuses to let it decay, and the rest of me working for the program that keeps it there.